Welcome back, folks, to the WP-Tonic this week in WordPress and SaaS. Got a great interview. You've just got me as the host. Andrew is unfortunately ill with COVID. He is still in Portugal, recovering, getting better. My friend John Locke, I think I asked him to come in, but I think I left it to the last minute. But we've got a great guest and a friend of the show. Plus you got me. Could be worse, couldn't it, folks? And we've got Brian Coords. I butchered his surname. That you got used to that. So, Brian, would you like to quickly introduce, give a kind of 10, 20-second intro to the tribe?
Yeah, so I'm Brian Coords. I'm a developer out of California. My day job is I work at Howard Development and Consulting, and we kind of have a few projects. One of them is MasterWP, which is a newsletter and blog, and now podcast. And then we also have WP Wallet, which is a software that we run, Understrap, which is a kind of a popular theme for WordPress, and then a lot of client services. And so we kind of cover everything that we can.
That's great, Brian. We're going to be discussing this show, all WordPress, Gutenberg, full site editing. We're going to have a dive. It should be great. But before we get into the main meat and potatoes of the show, I've got a message from a couple of our major sponsors. We'll be back in a few moments, folks. We're coming back, folks. And I just want to point out that I've got some great special offers from some of the sponsors, some great recommendations of services and plugins. If you want to see and get all those goodies, all you have to do is go over to WP-Tonic/recommendations. So, Brian, let's get straight into it. So how did you get into the crazy world of web development, WordPress in general? What was the start of the journey?
Yeah, I was, into web development even in high school, just as kind of a nerdy kid. And, back in the days of making, websites on, Tripod and LiveJournal and that sort of stuff. But then my earlier career was teaching. So I was doing that for a while, and then just started building WordPress websites on the side. I was looking through my email trying to figure out when was the first time I used WordPress, because I've been asked that before. When did I start WordPress specifically? And so I kind of searched through my Gmail and went back, and it was about 10 years ago where I could find WordPress was the first time mentioned, but it was in an email basically of a client. I had built him a website. It was not very good. I think he paid me $200 for it, something like that. He couldn't really edit it. And at some point he emailed me and just said, what did you build me? I thought you were going to build me like a WordPress website so I could edit it myself. And I thought I should probably learn what WordPress is, because I'd never heard of it at that point. So that was the first time. It was, an unhappy client informing me that there was, better solutions than me, copy and pasting code that I was, frantically gathering online. And then from there, I just started building WordPress websites, working in-house at places. I think a lot of people work, you're the one WordPress developer at some nonprofit or something. I did that for a while, moved into freelancing, and then eventually started working with Howard Development about maybe 5 years ago, and just started building client websites, pretty consistently from then.
So Howard Development, is there a particular vertical or a particular type of client? What does Howard Development like? What are their ideal clients and the projects they like doing?
Yeah, our ideal client is marketing agencies. So what we do is we really work with marketing branding agencies who do the logo, they do the brand, they do the design, typically they do all of that sort of stuff. And then they want somebody that's going to come in and just make a WordPress website, specifically the way they designed it, exactly as they wanted it to look. And so we kind of jump in at that point, and, most of our clients are the agencies themselves.
Right, that's great. Sounds interesting. I imagine every day is different. So let's go into another question. We're in interesting times with WordPress. Like, I've just come back from WordPress Europe. It was I really enjoyed it. I'm still on holiday mode because I'm recording this from the UK. And then I'm off to Sweden in a couple of days. So it's a bit of a European UK odyssey. But I
Nice.
really enjoyed WordPress Europe. What would you say are some of the strengths, but also some of the weaknesses of WordPress in 2022? Because I think there are definitely strengths, but there's also weaknesses. I think personally, and I want to see if you agree with this, we're at a very interesting time and position when it comes with WordPress. First of all, would you agree with that? And on your own reflection, what do you see some of the strengths and weaknesses of the WordPress platform in this year?
Yeah, I think you're right. I feel like it was maybe 5 years ago when the Gutenberg project started. There was that similar kind of feeling of where are things going? Things are kind of shifting. I think this year sort of matches that year in terms of there's a lot more questions about what the next steps are, and there's sort of like a big open space of what's happening next. There's a lot of questions about if we're growing, if people are joining, if there's enough contributors to WordPress in general, all that sort of stuff. So I kind of agree with you. Honestly, though, overall, it's a strong platform. I don't think it's going anywhere. I think it's pretty popular. I think it's flexible. We're all using it. But, I read it. It was an article. It was, I think, Kim Coleman posted an article basically comparing WordPress to the really strong SaaS offerings like Squarespace or Shopify or something. And she had a good, basically, breakdown of, all of the strengths that we love about WordPress, that it's open, flexible, do whatever you want with it, change it, plugins for everything. She was basically saying those are also kind of weaknesses for end users in the sense because everything looks different. No two sites look the same. You have to update it yourself. You're in charge of maintaining it. You're in charge of all these things. And she was basically kind of saying, not that it's good or bad, but just that the things that we kind of like about WordPress and how flexible it is can also be the sorts of things that maybe are tougher for end users or are make it a little more, you know, I would say harder to jump onto than like a Shopify or a Squarespace. So I feel like that's the place where the ecosystem is right now, where we're really trying to decide, do we want to make this extremely simple and easy for end users? Do we want to make it extremely powerful for developers who are going to build the ecosystem? And we're kind of, you know, seeing some places where we're losing the freedom for developers to get to control what it looks like, what the website is going to end up being, but we're also seeing more control for end users to get to drag and drop and build their own kind of websites. So I think there's definitely a transition point. There's definitely two different ways to look at it. I think the biggest weakness right now is just the overall narrative that WordPress is kind of slowing down or losing popularity, because it can become a little self-fulfilling if we all kind of decide that WordPress is not where the future is for building websites.
Yeah, I'm just wondering where to take this to reply to what you've just said. I'm going to try and not go on too much of a wander, because I can.
Go ahead.
I'm really struggling to format this in a coherent. Right, let's do this. There's two ways there's two elements to my response. I think number one is everything your colleague, or I forgot the lady's name that you mentioned that wrote this article about updating. Well, the truth is there's an army of companies, and WP-Tonic is one of them if you're looking to build a coaching membership website. But literally there's an army of companies that will maintain, update the plugins, advise you. There's an army of agencies, and you help a lot of these agencies. There's more than enough help out there if you don't want to update your plugins and make a bit of a mess of it. On it, so there's one of the strengths, and you saw it in Portugal, in Porto, is that there's literally an army, an ecosystem, a community, a very overused word, but you actually saw some of the reality of that overused metaphor. community in Porto. But on the other hand, developers are driven by the choices to some extent of the people that hire them. You have clients that come and say, I want advice about what is, or you have clients that don't really care what you built it on or build it on. And maybe they should care a little bit more. But then there's a whole group of clients that say, well, I don't want to build on WordPress because I've heard it's slow, there's security problems, and it's just difficult. I want to build on Shopify, or I want to build on Wix, or whatever it is. And that's what you build on because you've been told, because you want to still charge them. So that's complicated. And have I lost my plot? Have I been wandering? This is the question. So you got all that. But there was another point that was a bit better, actually. But give me a few seconds to recover my thoughts. What was your thoughts about my response to what you've just said?
Yeah, there's a few things. The first one you talked about, that there's plenty of agencies and developers. We're one of them. We have maintenance contracts for clients, and we're out there. And I think that's sort of the picture where we're seeing a lot more power in WordPress given to, the everyday user, and it's good, and that's a good thing. But also sometimes, we do want experts, and we do want, somebody who's helping you with your website who understands accessibility and SEO. And so when we get to DIY and people are building their own websites, like I wouldn't, maybe I wouldn't file my own taxes. I would want an expert to do it. If you're a business and you have a website, at a certain point, you probably should have an expert, looking at your website, because there's things like, the block pattern directory we've been talking about, where there's just bad accessibility, bad user experience patterns, things that aren't going to help you get search engine presence. And so
it's just come to, I just want to quick respond to that. And the actual other point has come back to me. Just a quick response is, I think it's a balance, because when you look at Shopify, if you look at Kajabi, which is in one of the main SaaS competitors in my niche area, there's a whole ecosystem about hiring Kajabi experts that will set everything up. There's a whole ecosystem of Shopify developers. If it was that easy to set up Shopify, or if it was that easy to set up Kajabi, there wouldn't be a whole ecosystem of implementers, developers, and consultants, would there?
Yeah.
The second point, I attended Matt Manoeg's question and answer session, and I thought one of the key things, and he said it before, but for some reason it came into my consciousness and much more stronger, is that he made it very clear at Porto, and I'm sure, like I say, he's done it before, that he actually sees Gutenberg as a bigger vector for Automatic than even WordPress. I actually think he sees Gutenberg being a much bigger project than ever WordPress was. Do you think I'm right? Because that's what he said he thought it could be at Porto. What's your own thoughts about that?
Yeah, number one, I'm jealous that you got to go to WordCamp, because I think there's something about that live in person. The WordCamp US is going to be here in California, so I'm very excited to get back into that real live person energy, because I think that kind of changes how we view projects.
I was told by people that they're only going to allow 650 people to attend. Is that correct?
The venue they picked is not a large venue, so that might make sense. So there might be a scramble to get tickets. That might be true. I'm not sure. I don't know how it was there. I think everyone has opinions about large in-person gatherings and how strict and safe they should be and that sort of thing. So I'm sure that plays into it.
It's difficult, because I was a little bit offish, but I'm English anyway, so I'm offish anyway. But I was a little bit about me. It was strange. I felt a bit. I'm not a strong introvert or a strong outrovert. I'm a mixture of both. But I got to be. It was my first really large event for 3 to 4 years, and it was a little bit intimidating. All these
Uh-huh.
people. I literally could stand. I could stand it for a couple of hours, and then I had to get away. I know it sounds ridiculous, but
No,
I felt.
that
I
makes.
felt
I
like.
mean,
Yeah, sorry.
no, I'd say that makes sense. It can be energizing, and then it can also be draining. At a certain point,
So
it's a
get
lot
back
of
to this. So do you
yeah,
agree that he really sees Gutenberg as something that could be even bigger than WordPress? He
yeah.
seems to see it as a really separate project. Really, that was the sense I was getting by seeing him live.
Yeah, I actually wrote a little bit about that part of his speech because, some of the examples of where they're putting it are, Tumblr and Day One, which are, owned by Automatic, and they're bringing Gutenberg into these projects, but those are not open source. Those are, closed, private, proprietary, for-profit ventures that are, they own. And so the example of we're taking Gutenberg and it's so big, but then we're really just pushing it into all of our private projects that are not going to be part of the open source ecosystem. I'm failing to see how Gutenberg benefits. I mean, Gutenberg is nice. I love the block editor. I'm a fan. But I'm just saying that sense that it's more important than WordPress itself, but the only implementations seem to be in these proprietary systems. It seems unclear how that's bigger in terms of the value for the open source community. I don't see where that part of it plays in, and I don't understand that argument. But I think we'll see. I think we'll see as it matures over the next few years.
Yeah, I think we're going to wrap up the first part of the show. We've got a ton to discuss. Brian's up for it. Hopefully he'll stay for some bonus content because a half hour won't be enough. We'll be back in a few moments, folks. We're coming back. It's a bit more quieter and organised, isn't it, Brian?
It's very peaceful.
He joined us when I was doing the Friday show, folks, last week at Porto. I was attempting to do a live show at a conference with almost 3,000 people. We pulled it off in the end, though, Brian, didn't we? You got to admire me for my steadfastness. All right. So before, I also just want to remind you that I do my own weekly newsletter, which I do editorial. I didn't do one last week because I was traveling. I will attempt to do one this week. You can get that by going to WP-Tonic/newsletter and sign up. And like I say, I do a weekly one and I do a good editorial and I think it's interesting. Hopefully you will. So let's delve back into the world of WordPress. I think also, Matt, some of the questions were, I think one of the questions that was put to him at the end of conference was that it's dominated by PHP developers. That's the reality. PHP got a bit of a bad rap, but with frameworks like Laravel, I think it's come back strong. But it's now WordPress, is dominated to some extent by JavaScript and React. I think that's one of the other factors. I think that's caused a lot of difficulty for plugin shops, agencies like yourself, the kind of skill set that you need to require, the complexion of the projects. This is a very multiple facet question I'm putting to you, but I think this is one of the factors that's also been introduced to the brew that has put us where we are in the second quarter 2022. How do you respond to that? Do you think I'm on the right track?
Yeah, I mean, I think the language that you write in affects the way that you see what you're working on. So if you're somebody who spends a lot of time in HTML and CSS and you're very focused on the front end and you're visual and you're creative, that's one way to look at things. I think because so much of the work is now in JavaScript, which makes sense. It's really the only way to build that kind of snappy app, feeling. But then we have a lot of JavaScript focused developers, and they're also controlling a lot of what's happening on the front end of websites to an extent that was never there before. But they're, at heart JavaScript developers, and you can tell by the way that they think and the way they organize things. And so I think there was a good interview. It was Mark Root-Wiley, who's been pushing for this kind of CSS standards in WordPress. And he talked about that, how it's just, now we're at this, there's a bit of a conflict between developers like us who want to control the front end and, the Gutenberg project, which is really deciding what the HTML and CSS are going to look like from WordPress core. And so that's a new place to be. But, at the end of the day, JavaScript is important. React is important. It's going to be around, and it's going to be a part of the modern internet, and that's just a fact.
I think you just made a really great observation there, like, may I say, because what you seem to be hinting, I never thought of it that way, is because there's always been these breakpoints which have existed in smaller to medium projects, and in the world of larger projects and corporate have always been different, where you had somebody who was a graphic designer that could do HTML and do some things with jQuery and knew a good bit of the functions that made WordPress, but they weren't a hardcore PHP WordPress backend developer. There just wasn't. Now you've introduced this whole different bucket of skills, and I think the thing that you touched, which was so interesting, a mindset, a really different mindset, where that front end developer has actually got in mindset maybe more linkage to the graphic person, how their mind works, than the traditional server end plugin, really strong back end PHP skills. Am I on to anything there, Brian?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the fundamental shift in how WordPress has been working recently, where it the people who had just those front end skills are, if you're gonna use the block editor and you can't really control what comes out of it, they make it's so much easier to build a page in the block editor, but you get that ease by taking out any sense of control. I can't write my own custom HTML in the block editor. I mean, I can, but it doesn't really work that way. And so, by taking away that sense of control and that stuff, and saying, well, now you need to build it as a custom block using JavaScript, using these, very different languages. It just means that people who have a different type of experience, a different type of mindset, are going to have to go in different directions. And that's, I think, what we're seeing. And, there's a lot of benefit to JavaScript, but it's definitely a different skill set than the creative designer who wants to make something unique.
And I think it was interesting when he said when he was actively a hardcore PHP, he actually dreamt in PHP. Have you dreamt in PHP code, Brian?
I don't think I've ever dreamt in code. No, I still have dreams where I'm a waiter and I, forgot everybody's order, but that's as close as my dreams get to my work life from 20 years ago,
Right. So let's go on to the next question. Full site editing. Is it the offspring of the devil, or whoever you talk to say, bit like Gutenberg, a bit like WordPress in 2022? It really depends. I've never known such a diverse point of views from people that I respect. You can get points of views from people that you think they're just idiots. But I've never known from Paul from WP-Tut, who's not the biggest fan of Gutenberg, to Spencer and Sally, who have a love affair. Well, Sally's got a total love affair with Gutenberg and full site editing, where Spencer likes Gutenberg but thinks full site editing is the devil's spew, or the bridge too far. And I don't know where I am. I just stay with Elementor and offering it to my clients and that, because I love the idea of Gutenberg and I can't wait, but I'm still a little bit reluctant about jumping Elementor into the world of Gutenberg. So everybody seems to be all over the place. Do you sense that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It is a very divisive issue. I think there's the block editor itself. I love. I was writing in Google Docs the other day and was trying to do things that were like Gutenberg, because I'm just so used to using it now, and I write blog posts directly in it, and it feels really good. I like that part of it. To me, full site editing, I've made the argument that I don't think it should have been in core. I think there's so much other stuff that could be improved, and full site editing is really useful for one part of a market, but I don't really think that it's useful for every single website. Whereas, the back end of WordPress and the media library and all these things, those are used on every website, and they've looked the same for the last 10 years and could really use a refresh. Full site editing, to me, I think would have been a great plugin, somewhere with like BuddyPress and BBPress and these plugins that you can use, and they work really well and they're supported by WordPress, but it doesn't show up on every site because I do think it takes a lot of the air out of the room. And at this point, Elementor, Beaver Builder, they're just so much better. So it's hard to say that I would want to, I actually built my personal blog with the default theme and full site editing. And it's a beautiful theme, but I cannot get it to look like what I want it to look like, because I can't change it. So I'm probably closer to Spencer. I really do like the block editor, but I would love to see the block editor styles and that sort of stuff show up in the rest of WordPress instead of trying to bring the rest of WordPress into that full site editing.
Do you have any thoughts of why, to me, the full site editor, it does need some, because I was talking to Christina a few weeks ago on this show, and she makes her living by teaching newbies WordPress, and she hates Gutenberg, and she won't teach it to her newbies because it's I think one of its problems, it needs some substantial UX love, and it needs a good session of sorting out, a good concentrated spurt of investment, UX expertise to get it up to snuff, because there's a lot of potential, I think. But when it comes to it, really, those in the know seem to be determined to push full site editing. Have you got any insight? Am I correct, and why this? I get this feeling that they're determined. Why they're so determined?
Yeah, that is a good question. I agree with you that the interface itself, there's a lot of icons that feel meaningless and pop up drawers and windows and panels and things and everywhere. And yeah, it's a lot. It feels like a lot. And I think if we took the last 3 years that were full site editing and just only made the block editor itself better, I think we'd all be a lot happier, because it would just be more, they could have used that attention there instead of trying to do full site editing. But I'm not sure. There's been the theory that they're trying to take on the page builders element. Elementor is growing faster really than WordPress is. WordPress is growing. Elementor itself is growing inside there much faster. They're doing really well. They had a really good acquisition. They raised a lot of money last year. That, you know, it's very powerful. So is there a sense that, you know, the people in charge of WordPress want to make sure that they can compete with Elementor, even though it's all the same ecosystem? I'm not really sure, but it's, you know, I don't think there's anything that anyone's going to say that's going to stop them from making that the full focus of what goes forward. You know, unfortunately.
It does seem that way, but I'm just puzzled because it does seem to be linked. Yeah, you know, but it's like we're looking in, you know, around the corner, but we can't quite focus. So we're trying to work out things, and we just don't have all the information, do we? So in some ways, it's a bit pointless. But being that you write a really great newsletter, and I run a WordPress in my 701st episode,
Yeah.
that is our job, though, isn't it, Craig? To peer where others dare not peer.
Yeah. I mean, you know, it's somebody needs to have the conversations and think about these things and try to push, you know, the leadership to be a little more transparent in what they're thinking, just because our jobs depend on it. You know, our mortgages depend on
Yeah,
it. So
I do sometimes wonder why there has to be this air of mysticism almost. I do understand a company, you have to keep things a bit tight to themselves, but sometimes I think this is more of a cultural issue, which is most bizarre in an fundamentally open source, supposedly community focused and driven platform, isn't it? It's quite bizarre in some ways.
yeah, I mean, yeah, that was my big topic this week was, you know, how open source or just, you know, the way that we call open source and the way we've framed it for the last 20 years maybe doesn't make sense, you know, going forward, because at the end of the day, there are big private companies who do own these things, and, you know, and they're doing a good job and they're giving us a lot of great software, but you know, when there's 43% of this massive internet billion-dollar economy running on it, then sometimes the old language of open source and stuff doesn't feel like it makes as much sense. Yeah.
I would say I see where you're coming from. I just think it needs some thought because Matt, like I say, at Porto, he's a you know, he seems still to be very, very committed to the principles of GPL and open source, doesn't he?
I I think so. I mean, I'm a Matt Mullenweg fan. I think so. I think he is. You know, just that being said, like I said, a lot of the work is moving into, you know, his company too is not open source. So, and I know that it, you know, it's hard to be open source. That's not easy and stuff, but a lot of the things that are getting built today are, you know, the WordPress apps, the other sites owned by Automatic. A lot of these things, you know, aren't, you know, open in the same sense unless you're using, you know, their ecosystem. So it's kind of a tough, you know, it kind of goes both ways.
Well, just to wrap up before we wrap up the podcast part of the show, and Brian's agreed to stay on for some bonus content, which you can watch the whole interview plus the bonus content on the WP-Tonic YouTube channel. Please go over there. And please, if you're generous, subscribe to the channel, because not only does it help the channel, it also helps the podcast. Just to finish off, is I don't see it as totally 0 or 1 or black and white situation. You know, I don't want to go into politics, but I'm a pragmatist. I have particular principles. I come from the tradition of Christian socialism. So I have a particular ideology that drives me, but but that ideology, it changes with the facts and with the pragmatism of the situation. So what I mean by that, I don't, you know, you get others that say everything should be free market. I don't believe that, nor do I believe that everything should be controlled by the government. I believe that there's some industries, some that should be owned by a government, or there's definitely other areas that shouldn't have any government involvement. And I think that's what you probably will find with open source. There are parts and areas of it that should not, that are best in the open source arena, and then there's probably other areas that are better done by a private. Is that making any sense, or am I waffling?
No, that makes a lot of sense. I think, at the end of the day, a lot of these things are going to be owned by a huge corporation or a huge, government type of a thing. And the nice thing about government is at least you get to vote. No one's voting for Mark Zuckerberg to be in charge of Facebook, and that's a little scary.
You're getting me hot and bothered now, Brian. Did you have to mention him? I always get a bit. There's certain names that start getting me sweating, Brian.
Yeah.
Right. Brian's laughing at my jokes, so that's always good, isn't it, Tribe? So we're going to end the podcast part of the show. Like I say, Brian's agreed to stay on. You'll be able to watch the bonus content and the whole interview on the WP-Tonic YouTube channel. Please subscribe. We'll be back next week. Hopefully with Andrew, he will be allowed back into the UK, recovered, relaxed from his illness in Porto. And we got some fabulous guests. We'll see you soon, folks. Bye. So we're coming back. So what do you... It's time to get your crystal ball out, Brian. Start rubbing it right now. Try and clear the fog, Brian. You're not looking worried enough, Brian. You should do. So what do you see? Where do you see us in the next 12 months to maybe 18 months? Where do you think WordPress and Gutenberg's going to be in a year's time?
Yeah, there's a few things. I think just our industry, like all industries, we're dealing with the kind of COVID moving into post-COVID, and that's, everything feels kind of crazy because numbers and markets and interest in our web design business, went crazy during COVID, settled back down. So a lot of that stuff, I think we're just seeing it leveling out and nobody knows what's happening there. But 12 to 18 months, full site editing should theoretically be, out of beta. It's still technically a beta software is what it says on the back end of WordPress. But, in 12 to 18 months, it shouldn't be. And I think once that happens, I think a lot of people are afraid to use it or, to build on it in a certain way or to build plugins for it or something. I think hopefully by then it'll feel stable enough to where people can say, well, it's here, it's stable, it's not beta software, things shouldn't be breaking changes anymore, and that maybe we'll see a lot of cool third-party things happening around it, and it'll feel like a more native, real part of WordPress and not this kind of hazy, ever-changing thing that we're not really sure where it's headed. So that's my optimistic goal, or vision: the stable, bigger industry around full site editing. We know what's coming next. The next parts of Gutenberg are way more exciting, in my opinion. And all of that. That's probably the first part of my answer.
When you look at some of the possibilities of the libraries, the patterns, where you see the possibility of regeneralizing. I can't talk now. The WordPress egos, the third-party system. But on the other hand, I truly believe that full site editing should be pushed down. There's some great, like Cadence, what's come from the Astra team. There's about 3 or 4 major quasar framework themes, whatever. I think they should just buy one of them or work with them. They provide the kind of framework and a methodology that's well understood in the market outside Gutenberg. concentrate on really tidying up the editor, the UX. And I think the third thing that we haven't discussed, which also puzzles me, is what do you think, where do you think, and what do you think should be done about WooCommerce? Because I see enormous possibilities, and it is still the major competitor to Shopify. These two very different, not only in philosophy, but you couldn't have two totally different animals that are really head to head, really, aren't they? There are other players out there, but I don't know. First of all, would you agree it really is a world of either WooCommerce or Shopify? And secondly, I, I think the WooCommerce situation's even worse than the Gutenberg in some ways. What's your feelings about that?
Yeah, we've talked about that at our agency where you get somebody coming in maybe on a lower budget and they're e-commerce. And so we'll just say, we can't really justify building a WooCommerce site for you at your budget. So, we'll help you set up a Shopify site and you'll have less options, but you'll have something that we can just send you off with and we'll feel good about it. And we've just wondered why there's not a version of that for WooCommerce. You know what I mean? There's not. And there was an interview, Matt Medeiros interviewed the CEO of WordPress.com, and it kind of asked him a little bit about that, about, are they trying to compete with Shopify? And he just kind of didn't have an answer for it, or he just gave kind of a generic answer. But I mean, I would love to go to WordPress.com and have an e-commerce, very centric way, and we could take clients there. And we know that if they do do really well in their business in 3 years, they'll come back for a bigger WordPress, self-hosted thing, or, bring them into the ecosystem at least. But it just seems like, yeah, I think a lot of people feel like, what is happening there? Why is WooCommerce?
Well, it's the same as Kajabi and some of the other SaaS space. People say to me, yeah, Shopify, but, just understand what you're getting involved with and know when you should drop it and go to WooCommerce. And it all sounds so plausible, doesn't it? But the reality is, you get sucked. That is their purpose. You get sucked into the world of Shopify. You get in shop, and then there's some functionality that they're, I think it's called Liquid, isn't it? Because can't do. So you go to the Shopify third-party extension world, don't you? And you start bolting on these third-party JavaScript, and you plug another one, and then you end up with a bit of a jumbled up beast, don't you?
Yeah.
And then it's very expensive to get it all moved and implemented into WooCommerce. Because I haven't done one of those because I've specialised in membership, and I haven't done one of those for about 4 years. But the last one I did was extremely messy, Brian, trying to get it all in and get something working, because the last one I dealt was, they were doing about 10 to 20 million, and it had grown into a rather big jumbled up Shopify beast, and the reliability was getting a bit flaky with all these third-party JavaScript add-ons.
Yeah.
It wasn't the reality of that type of Shopify didn't match with their propaganda. Is this making any sense? And does it match some of your own experiences, Brian?
Yeah, I mean, it's we kind of have a lot of the same issues. Shopify in one sense has it easier because they're a SaaS and they can control things, and WooCommerce has to be, so decentralized. So, that makes anything they want to do harder and take longer to get it to work right. But we've had, a lot of those same experiences with, all of these things. And sometimes it just comes down to, if you're running a business, you just should have, and your business is your website and that's where you make your money. you just need to have somebody that handles that. You can't just go into Shopify and just start adding random extensions. You should really trust an expert on that because it's your business, and
Yeah,
that's the way it
I
works.
think the
But
point I was trying to make, I know I was wandering off a bit, but I think the point I was trying to make is that they're proper. It is easier to start off with than WooCommerce, because I just think WooCommerce is so painfully difficult, unnecessarily difficult to start off with, isn't it? It's ridiculously
yeah,
difficult, really, isn't it? But on the other hand, with Shopify, it's a lot easier to get started with and get traction. But when you start delving beyond that stage, my experience, it rapidly gets as bad or even worse than WooCommerce.
yeah. And part of that, one example is we set up a site for somebody on Shopify. Shopify has a whole developer. They can give us access. They can give us credentials. I'm setting up a WooCommerce site for a client. They have to give me their password to WordPress.com is the only way I can help them set everything up, because there's no way for a developer to set up. And then I got to buy them probably $1,500 worth of annual subscriptions for, I mean, that's a whole nother story. The prices of these extensions for WooCommerce are just, so it becomes this whole thing in that early phase where they're just starting. It's really hard to make that justification. It's really hard to say, yeah, jump in now. It's extremely convoluted. You need $1,500 a year of extensions to get it running, so, and then, like you said, once it gets bigger and you're making a lot of money, it makes more sense to use WooCommerce, but it's harder to make that transition off of Shopify. But if I'm a developer, I'm a little skeptical too of Shopify, because if you come up with any good third-party extension, they will copy your features and they'll
Well,
basically take your features.
I was talking to the founder, Rayleigh, when that's what he had, another business, I forgot it, and they had a good 4 or 5 years, and then Shopify just said to them, "You got a year's notice. We're closing you down after a year. We don't like we're going to do what you're doing, and we don't like what you're doing at the reservoir either."
Yeah.
So, but that's a whole different story when you're building a secondary business on a enclosed
Yeah.
system. You're asking for trouble, aren't you?
Yeah.
Because
That's that.
your partnership, as you get more successful, you become more of a liability to the company that was your partner, right? And you're seen more. But in some ways, that is the relationship between Automatic and Animator also, isn't it? There
Yeah.
are some. It just give you one more question. How do you see? Because we just had it this week with Static being bought by Animator. We've had the recent purchase of a number of plugins from Delicious Brains from WP Engine. How do you think, where are these 3 to 4 major hosting companies in the next, because that's one of the things I think is going to be interesting in the next year to 18 months, is how these hosting companies, their relationship with Automatic and WordPress, and how do you see that panning out? Because they are still buying these plugins. They are still GPL licensed. They could put them in an enclosed wall, but because of GPL, that's going to be tricky. You think they're just considering they're just going to offer these plugins at a very competitive or for free if you buy their hosting? Do you think that's what they what? Spencer says hosting is finished anyway, and that's what I think. It's much more complicated than that. But have you got any idea if they've got any idea? I suppose that's what I'm asking you.
Yeah, that was on my list of predictions, is wondering, what the goal is with these, because you know, the latest one of Stratic, where it's Elementor, who was a plugin, you know, started as a plugin and has grown obviously to be super successful. Buying a host is sort of the unusual one, because it's always the hosts buying the plugins. You know, this is the one time it was a little bit different. And so it makes it feel like the hosting is the place to be, because they're the ones making the acquisitions. Elementor is trying to be a host. Everyone's trying to be a host. So I'm not sure, but you know, when WP Engine bought Studio Press and they bought Genesis, we were using Genesis, we were using WP Engine, and I kind of had that same idea. Are they going to make this really, you know, unique experience that's just perfect for WP Engine and Studio Press and Genesis, you know? And it never really happened. And I don't even think they do anything with Genesis anymore. But you know, they buy these plugins. You think, are they going to make this kind of streamlined thing? But you know, I don't know, because oftentimes we build sites, we try to pick the host, but we don't get to pick the host. You know, we can't say, you know, you need this, we recommend this host. Sometimes a client just says, no, I just want this other budget host. I have other sites on it or whatever. So, you know, are they going to make these little closed little bubbles where I could go to Liquid Web and I could get all those plugins for free and I could do it in one bundle? It hasn't happened yet, so I don't know what they're doing. I have no crystal ball on the end game of the plugin and acquisition
It's
race.
fascinating. It's fascinating that they've all gone down this route, but I don't think anybody I've never come across anybody in these hosting companies that have really attempted or could explain to me in private or on this podcast what is the business model, what is the business logic. I've never heard anybody really. The only one is WP Engine, and that, like you say, that's because I felt that kind of Genesis I was never a big fan. And, you know, and I suppose the player that we're waiting for to do what Elementor and is the Divi world, because the Divi world is totally alien to me. You know,
Mhm.
Stephanie and Andrew, who Stephanie's my co-host for the Friday show normally, they're big. They got they built up their own tribe as being part of the Divi world. It's never like Sally is big, has been one of the founders of the Genesis Studio Press world.
Mhm.
She's old school, big member of that community, where Andrew and Stephanie are big in the Divi. And I've never been part, but the Divi is an enormous subset, isn't it? It's got an enormous, rampant user base. I suppose I, I imagine Divi is going to do what Elementor are doing. Would you see that coming?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like they're, you know, you get tied into these ecosystems. I was really into Beaver Builder like 6 years ago. I thought that was the best page builder. And then I was in, you know, groups about it, and I, you know, used the add-ons and all of this. And then I think, you know, attention shifted to Elementor. I think they're all, you know, they're all still there, but they, you know, they're all there. And, you know, maybe that's part of it. Maybe it's just building up that community, and buying things like Studio Press is just buying the attention of a developer
Well,
community
when it
that they
comes
think.
to WP Engine, they really didn't. But I just wondered really the reason. Those that have been building Genesis websites, they still use it because it works, and the end result does what the client wants, and they can do it rapidly. But the reason to utilize Genesis, which was performance orientated, has died a long time ago. But I think WP Engine really bought it because of the very large development community that it had. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's bought these plugins from Delicious Brains, because in community orientation, it does kind of fit, doesn't it?
Yeah, they definitely fit. And if they can, you know, Advanced Custom Fields is in trouble with their lifetime licenses. I think maybe, you know, a lot of us have been using it and haven't paid for it in probably 8 years. If they can solve that problem, or just subsidize it, or honestly, if they just want to make everyone pay again, I probably would just pay. I think it's worth it. But if they can solve that problem, they're going to have a ton of developer goodwill. If they keep those plugins, all the plugins that team makes are pretty critical, I think, for developers. We use a lot of them on every site. If they can keep them running in a long-term healthy way, then I mean, it'll be worth, I think, the goodwill of it, I guess.
Well, I think I've taken you enough time. I think it's been a fabulous discussion. We've covered a lot of territory, haven't we, Brian? We really have
Yeah,
had
I
a big
agree.
scope. Hopefully Brian will be semi-regularly joining us on the roundtable show. It won't be as disastrous as last week wasn't. It was a really rocky start, but when we got into it, I thought we covered some good stuff on that show. But thank you, Brian. It's been a blast, a great discussion. We'll see you soon next week, and hopefully Andrew will be back. We've got enough of some fabulous guests like Brian. We'll see you soon. Bye.
Thank you.